I obtained DMT from a friend and had already taken a hit from the same batch 2 days earlier, along with several friends. I was booked to leave for Burning Man, my first time, the following morning. I wanted neither to transport the DMT nor to lose it while I was away, and had been interested in mixing salvia and DMT, especially since consensual reality had still seemed far more present and real than I had hoped or expected when tripping on either alone. I obtained 20 grams straight, dried, unfortified, salvia leaf from a local dealer of sacred plants, and decided that chewing it would be much gentler on my throat, and reduce the risk of burning the DMT instead of sublimating it, as well as providing a slower onset than smoking, to enable me to better control the relative timing of the salvia and DMT peaks. I was with a friend, whose freebase pipe I was using for the DMT, in the covered patio in her backyard. It was warm and had rained earlier in the day. It was roughly 11:30 p.m. when I arrived. My flight out the next morning left at around 7 a.m. The hosting and trip-sitting friend volunteered in harm reduction at raves, so was chosen as a particularly capable trip-sitter. There was a patio table, and I was sitting in one of the chairs at the table near a short cinder block wall separating the patio from the garden, making it easier to spit out salvia dregs into the garden when done chewing them. I had a pint glass of water before beginning to make sure that my mouth could be moist enough to keep the salvia chewable, and had some water set in front of me in this glass to add to my mouth if needed. I pulled as much leaf as I could pinch between 2 fingers out from the bag, placed it in my mouth and began to chew. After a couple of minutes, I spat it out and repeated with a new chunk of leaves. The first few times, my mouth was still a bit too dry, so I spat out the entire quid, rinsed my mouth, and took a swig of water before repeating. This was producing a very slight alteration of perception, but did not feel as though it would get me across the salvia threshold. I filled my mouth with as much salvia as I could reasonably chew, and when it came time to put in some more, I pressed the mass of leaf against the front of my mouth to squeeze all the salvia-steeped saliva out, then held the saliva, and some salvia, in my mouth, while pushing the compressed plant material out of my lips. I then topped the salvia back up, and added small swigs of water for moisture as needed. As this process continued, my perception of reality was getting gradually more altered, and I noticed that I was spilling more leaf on the table in front of me, and on my lap, as I was trying to put it into my mouth. Somewhere around the 5th round of this process, I noticed that I was also drooling out some of the saliva that I was trying to conserve while spitting out the spent leaf. The striped awning over the neighbor's patio was becoming unified with the vertical stripes my mind was forming from the planks in the fence between the yards. At this point, I considered it evident that it was time to take the DMT before the effects of the salvia made it impossible. I spat out the remainder of my quid, rinsed out my mouth, and motioned for the DMT. At this point, there was probably about 5 grams of leaf left. The effects of the salvia continued to creep up as I smoked the DMT, and the simple act of inhaling the vapor had already picked up a considerable otherworldly quality. Upon exhalation, the DMT kicked in quickly, and the striped awning acquired the character of an awning over a carny game before my eyes closed, I think, and I was treated to the crisp, contrasting, primary colored DMT visuals, twisting through the shape of so many banners/scroll/circus cage decoration patterns. I then experienced myself as being at a carnival on an alien plane, entirely removed from time and space. The carnival disappeared, leaving the plane, and then nothing. At some point as everything was disappearing, I lost my sense of self and merely perceived there to be some sort of thing, what used to be me, somehow present in this otherwise total void. I felt to have been there long enough that I was sure that this thing/me had not only missed it/my flight the following morning, but possibly the entire rest of it/my life. This was all to the extent that long enough existed there. It was more a feeling that it/I would be unable to rejoin normal time at an appropriate instant. I began to feel some sort of pity for this external me and a remorse, which I can't really identify as mine or not, at having disappointed my friends and family by not having been able to do all the things I still had planned, e.g., providing their ride from SF to the burn. While beginning to experience this regret, I began to feel normal time and space returning, and could perceive a surface in front of me, upon which I could lay my head to drool. At this point, I was also beginning to depersonalize. As I rested my head upon the table, I began to recognize the space as the same space from which I had embarked upon my trip, but still had no sense that any amount of time smaller than an eternity had passed while I was away. I also began to appreciate that I had been, and still was, tripping, but had little enough of a sense of my surroundings or my body to dispel the suspicion that I had been away for hours, and probably pissed myself while I was gone. After an indescribable period of time drooling on the table, I heard my sitter's voice asking me if I was coming out of it. I felt a tremendous relief that I had somehow managed to return to a time close enough to that of my departure that my friend was not only still alive, but still sitting there waiting for my trip to finish. I paused a moment, and then felt normal enough to sit back up in my chair and nod. There were some slight persistent visuals whose details I can no longer remember, and I didn't yet feel capable to try and make any major movements. My sitter reminded me that I would probably want to try and stand up about 5 minutes before I'd properly regained the ability to do so. Upon hearing this, it became clear to me at this point that I'd only been away for a few minutes, and that I hadn't pissed myself. I felt it to be deeply miraculous that my, admittedly carefully researched and planned, trip hadn't actually cost me my life. I sat and chatted for about half an hour, as the visuals began to pass. I then decided that, since I'd felt ready to try and stand up some 20 minutes ago, I was probably ready to try walking. I got up, walked across the patio, and was successful, so my sitter and I dismissed each other, and I went home, feeling a remarkable excitement to be alive, and in the time and place where I ought to be. The bike ride home took about 20 minutes and did not feel particularly difficult, nor did I have any disagreeable interactions with traffic. I arrived home shortly before 1 a.m., I showered, shaved, and went to bed. The only negative effects I experienced the next morning were fatigue, but that is more readily attributed to my having only had around 3.5 hours to sleep before having to catch a taxi over to the airport in time to check my copious luggage